Okay, picking up where we left off, this is part 2 of chapter 13, the lecture. We were talking about the stability of personality. Now we're going to talk about how personality can change. Traits reflect developmental constructs that change over time, change over the life course in response to life events. When behaviors, thoughts, or emotions change and do so repeatedly over time, people can come to see themselves in a new light. These stable shifts in behavior, thoughts, or feelings lead people to perceive themselves differently. Age-related change. With age, people become less neurotic, less extroverted, and less open to new experiences. They also tend to become more agreeable and more conscientious. Age-related changes in personality occur independently of environmental influences. Therefore, that personality change may be based in biological processes. The pattern of personality changes across age holds in different cultures as well. Conscientiousness at different ages in 5 cultures. 5 cultures here were examined: German, British, Spanish, Czech, and Turkish. Note that the bars are missing from this graph because data was not available for the 14 to 17 age group in Spain and the 22 to 19 age group in Turkey. In all 5 cultures, though, conscientiousness increased as people age. Situational causes of personality change. Many of the changes observed as people go through adulthood may be due in part to the new duties and obligations that growing older typically involves, such as forming long-term relationships, having children, and building a career. In general, personality changes occur as a consequence of the expectations and experiences associated with age-related roles such as becoming a spouse, parent, and employee. Even apparently trivial life events may have large effects on personality development. Many life events are unpredictable, such as accidents and illnesses. One recent study examined personality change among people who were caregivers for a spouse with terminal cancer. Compared to the control group, the bereaved caregivers became more agreeable, sociable, a component of extroversion, and conscientious. Researchers also examined college students who traveled abroad compared to a group of control students who did not. Those who chose to travel were more extroverted and had higher scores on openness to experience at the beginning of the study, as you might imagine. 1 year later, they showed reliable increases in openness and agreeableness along with a decrease in neuroticism. As this graph illustrates, bereaved caregivers reliably experienced more positive personality changes than the control group did. As this graph illustrates, college students who traveled abroad also reliably experienced more positive personality changes than a control group did, and they became less neurotic. Researchers have even used experimental methods in an attempt to directly change personality. Experimentally produced personality change in this graph is compared to the control group. The experimental group showed an increase to openness and experience after weeks of training. Culture influences personality. Do different cultural norms translate into reliable cultural differences in personality? One research team conducted a careful investigation of personality differences across 56 nations. They found that the Big Five personality traits are valid across all of those countries. Here's an example from that study. A team of more than 120 scientists investigated the Big Five personality traits around the world, from Argentina to Zimbabwe. This chart presents some of their findings. Gender differences. Women and men are much more similar than different in terms of personality, but the differences between them largely support common stereotypes. Gender differences in personality are largely in societies in North America and Europe, which provide more equal opportunities and treatment than many other societies, and smallest in Asian and African communities. People in individualist cultures, such as within Western Europe and Northern America, tend to compare themselves against other groups. How is personality assessed? Psychologists measure personality by having people report on themselves, by asking people's friends or relatives to describe them, or by observation. Researchers use multiple methods to assess personalities. Assessment procedures include measures of unconscious processes, life history data, behavioral data, self-reports, and descriptions from people's friends, relatives, or both. The way researchers choose to measure personality depends to a great extent on their own theoretical orientations. For example, are they trait researchers or humanistic psychologists? The assessment of personality follows two approaches: the ideographic approaches and the nomothetic approaches. The ideographic is person-centered approaches to studying personality, focuses on the individual lives and how various characteristics are integrated into unique persons. Central traits are especially important for how individuals define themselves. People consider secondary traits less personally descriptive or not applicable. In the nomothetic approaches, this is an approach to assessing personality that focuses on how common characteristics vary from person to person. The five-factor theory looks at how all people vary on 5 basic personality traits. All right, projective measures. Projective measures are personality traits that examine unconscious processes by having people interpret ambiguous stimuli. The general idea is that people will project their mental contents onto an ambiguous item. Through these projections, people will reveal hidden aspects of personality such as motives, wishes, and unconscious conflicts. One of these tests is called the Rorschach inkblot test, which you may have heard of before. A person in this situation looks at apparently meaningless ink blots and describes what it appears to be. In another test, the thematic apperception test, a person is shown an ambiguous picture and is asked to tell a story about it. All right, here's an example. Projective measures are meant to provide insight into a particular person's personality by allowing the person to project unconscious thoughts onto ambiguous images. As shown here in the top image, a Rorschach inkblot test, and B, the bottom picture, is an example of the pictures in which they would have to come up with a story for. Self-reports. Many assessments of personality include self-report questionnaires. Measuring only what the person reports, they make no pretense of uncovering hidden conflicts or secret information. More often, an objective measure will include a large inventory of traits. The Neo-Personality Inventory consists of 240 items, which are designed to assess the big 5 personality factors. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI, was first developed in the 1930s. The MMPI has 10 scales that measure psychological problems, for example, paranoia, depression, mania, and hysteria. And there's the California Q-Sort. Each participant is given 100 cards with statements printed on them. The participant then sorts the cards into 9 piles according to how accurately the statements describe him or her. Here's an example of the California Q-Sort. These are items. These are 3 of the cards a participant sorts when taking a Q-Sort assessment. You see on one of it says, prides self on being objective or rational, seeks reassurance from others, or characteristically pushes and tries to stretch limits, sees what he or she can get away with. Life history data. Researchers who use ideographic approaches often examine case studies of individuals through interviews or biographical information. A psychologist named Murray tried to account for Adolf Hitler's behavior in Nazi Germany by studying Hitler's early childhood experiences, his physical stature, and his personal motivations. They see human life as a narrative. In his personality analysis of Hitler, Henry Murray, in 1943, stated that the German leader was impotent in heterosexual relations and had engaged in same-sex relationship. Murray's report predicted Hitler's suicide. Behavioral data. Researchers have also developed a number of objective measures that assess how personality emerges in daily life. The electronically activated record, EAR. The EAR has also been used to show that self-reports on the Big Five traits predict real-world behavior. According to a study that used the EAR, extroverts talk more and spend less time alone. Agreeable people swear less often. Conscientious people attend class more often. And neurotic people spend more time arguing. And people open to experience spend more time in restaurants, bars, and coffee shops. Behavior and personality. How a person maintains a home or office is just one area in which personality is on display. You see the picture on the top is orderly and clean. The picture on the bottom seems very messy and things strewn about. Observers show accuracy and trait judgments. How well do observers' personality judgments predict others' behavior? Judgments of personality are important because personality heavily influences behavior. A person's close acquaintances show a surprising degree of accuracy for trait judgments. A psychologist named Psy200 compared the accuracy of people's self-judgments with the accuracy of how their friends describe them. The comparative accuracy depends on whether the traits are observable and whether the people being rated are motivated to view themselves positively on the traits. People are more accurate in rating themselves for traits that are hard to observe and less prone to bias because they are neutral. In judgments of personality traits, how accurate are people's self-ratings versus their friends' ratings? This chart, based on the data from the Psy200 study, shows the average accuracy scores for 3 types of traits. As shown on the left, self-ratings tend to be more accurate than friends' ratings for traits that are low in both observability and evaluativeness. As shown in the middle, friends' ratings tend to be more accurate than self-ratings for traits that are high in observability and low in evaluativeness. As shown on the right, friends' ratings tend to be especially accurate for traits that are low in observability and high in evaluativeness. What personality traits should you look for in a roommate? Positive roommate relationships can be a highlight of the college experience and can provide a foundation for lifelong friendships. Negative roommate experiences can add significant stress to the college experience and can even disrupt the mental health and academic performance of the students involved. Personality similarity between roommates was positively correlated with both relationship satisfaction and intent to live together the following year. When it comes time to select a roommate, look for someone who is similar to you, especially on the characteristics that are most important to you. It's a good idea to ask potential roommates about their cleanliness preferences. And speaking of, here is the level of cleanliness scale. I can tell you I probably had some roommates that I should have worked this out with before becoming roommates. Might want to heed the list. How do we know our own personalities? Each of us has a notion of something we call the self. The sense of self involves one's mental representations of personal experiences, which are memories and perceptions, one's thought processes, a sense of one's physical body, and a conscious awareness of being separate from others and unique. Our self-concepts consist of self-knowledge. Your self-concept is everything you know and believe about yourself. Answers commonly given by college students include gender, age, student status, interpersonal styles such as shy or friendly, personal characteristics such as moody or optimistic, and body image. Self-schema. Each person processes information about him or herself deeply, thoroughly, and automatically. The self-schema is the cognitive aspect of the self-concept, a network of interconnected knowledge about the self. The self-schema helps each of us quickly perceive, organize, interpret, and use information about the self. Researchers typically find that when people process information about themselves, there's activity in the middle of the frontal lobes. Damage to this area tends to alter how people see themselves. Activation of the frontal lobes clearly seems to be important in processing information about the self. As this example illustrates, the self-schema consists of interrelated knowledge about the self. Here, the concepts that overlap with the self, student, daughter, and sister, are most strongly related to the self. Concepts connected to the self with a solid line, type A, movies, soccer, and brunette, are not quite as strongly related to self-knowledge. Clothing connected to the self with a dotted line is related more weakly. Concepts with no connecting lines do not relate to the self. The self and prefrontal cortex activity. This brain scan comes from the 2002 study by Kelly and colleagues. The colored area in the brain region that was active when most people made trait judgments about themselves. That would be in the prefrontal cortex, right in the middle. Working self-concept. Psychologists refer to the immediate experience of the self as the working self-concept. Self-descriptions vary depending on which memories you retrieve, which situation you are in, which people you are with, and your role in that situation. When people consider who they are or think about different features of their personalities, they often emphasize characteristics that make them distinct from others. Perceived social regard influences self-esteem. Self-esteem is the evaluative aspect of the self-concept in which people feel worthy or unworthy. People can objectively believe positive things about themselves without liking themselves very much. People can have high self-esteem, even when objective indicators do not support such positive self-views. Reflected appraisal. This is self-esteem is based on how we believe others perceive us. People internalize the values and beliefs expressed by important people in their lives. They adopt those attitudes and related behaviors as their own. There's a tendency for self-esteem to fall during adolescence and to be at its lowest for people, especially young women between the ages of 18 and 22. Self-esteem typically increases across adulthood, peaking when people are in their 60s and falling off towards the end of life. All right, here's a graph that shows self-esteem over time. Apparently, age 80 to 90, there is no self-esteem. All right, sociometer theory. Psychologists named Leary and colleagues propose that self-esteem is a mechanism for monitoring the likelihood of social exclusion. Sociometer. This is an internal monitor of social acceptance or rejection. When a person's sociometer indicates low probability of rejection, the person will tend to experience high self-esteem. When a person's sociometer indicates the imminent possibility of rejection, the person will tend to experience low self-esteem. Self-esteem and life outcomes. Having high self-esteem seems to make people happier, but it does not necessarily lead to successful social relationships or life success. Downsides to having very high self-esteem. Violent criminals and bullies commonly have high self-esteem. When people with high self-esteem believe their abilities have been challenged, they may act in ways that cause other people to dislike them. Narcissism and the dark triad. A personality trait associated with inflated self-esteem is narcissism. Because narcissists' greatest love is for the self, they tend to have poor relations with others. A meta-analysis found an increase in narcissism among American college students between 1979 and 2006. Personality psychologists have described 3 negative personality traits that make up the dark triad: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. People use mental strategies for a positive sense of self. There's a study that showed people prefer the letters of their own names, especially their initials, to other letters. Sometimes these positive views of the self seem inflated. For instance, 90% of adults claim they are better than average drivers, even if they have been hospitalized for injuries caused by car accidents in which they were one of the drivers involved. When the College Entrance Examination Board surveyed more than 800,000 college-bound seniors, not a single senior rated herself or himself as below average, whereas a whopping 25% rated themselves in the top 1%. This phenomenon is known as the better than average effect. This graph shows the study participants' ratings of letters of the alphabet. Participants rated the letters of their names, particularly their first and last initials, as especially attractive. Here you can see there are the 3 different types of letter denoted by the color. Red is an initial, green is a non-initial, and blue is a letter not even in their name. You can see each one was very consistent. Most people have positive illusions, overly favorable and unrealistic beliefs in at least 3 domains. Most people continually experience the better than average effect. They unrealistically perceive their personal control over events. Most people are unrealistically optimistic about their own personal futures. Psychologists have cataloged a number of unconscious strategies that help people maintain a positive sense of self. Among the most common are social comparisons and self-serving biases. Social comparisons. This is the tendency for people to evaluate their own actions, abilities, and beliefs by contrasting them with other people's. People with high self-esteem tend to make downward comparisons, and people with low self-esteem tend to make upward comparisons. People use a form of downward comparison when they recall their own pasts. They often view their current selves as better than their former selves. The rating of the self across time. This graph shows the results of Wilson and Ross's 2001 study. College students rated their past selves as having had more negative features than their current selves, and their current selves as having more positive features. Self-serving biases. People with high self-esteem tend to take credit for success but blame failure on outside factors. The self-serving bias is the tendency for people to take personal credit for success but blame failure on external factors. We are extremely well equipped to protect our positive beliefs about ourselves, with some researchers arguing that self-serving biases reflect healthy psychological functioning. Are there cultural differences in the self-serving bias? An important way in which people differ in self-concept is whether they view themselves as fundamentally separate from or connected to other people. Collectivist cultures emphasize connections to family, social groups, and to ethnic groups, conformity to societal norms, and group cohesiveness. People in collectivist cultures have interdependent self-construals. And individualist cultures emphasize rights and freedoms, self-expression, and diversity. People in individualist cultures have interdependent self or independent self-construals. Their self-concepts are determined to a large extent by their social roles and personal relationships. Self-enhancement is universal, but the traits people focus on to achieve it vary across cultures. Cultural differences in construal. Self-construals differ across cultures. In the graph on the top, in individualist cultures, the most important elements of a person's self-construal tend to reside within the person. In the graph on the bottom, in collectivist cultures, the most important elements of a person's self-construal tend to reside in areas where the person's sense of self is connected to others. And with that, we conclude the lecture for Chapter 13 on personality.